Layer 2 review. Fulgur Ventures went and sponsored me to go write a big blog post on basically all of the covenant-dependent Layer 2 reviews and kind of how they fit together, and of course, what kind of soft forks might be needed for some of them. Many of them don't actually require soft forks, which is interesting. But with that in mind, really, if we're going to talk about Layer 2, we got to talk about. Well, that didn't work very well, did it? There we go. We got to go talk about what the heck is a fucking Layer 2. What you got to start with definitions, and as you'll see in a second, I think a lot of things get called Layer 2s that aren't really Layer 2s. But of course, we're also going to talk about Layer 2. I mean, certainly we should go talk about, well, what is a Layer 1? And it may sound obvious, but writing this blog post, I kind of had to go think through, what does this really mean? And I'd say the main thing about the idea of Layer 1 is it's transacting with passive security. And the security model is something along the lines of, let's suppose you have a Layer 1 wallet, you have some coins, and I don't know, maybe a certain filmmaker accuses you being Satoshi and you hide in a cave for 10 years. Just let it all die down. In a Layer 1 wallet, the security of your coins is really about proof of work. Now, depending on what you think about mining incentives, you may go say that, well, miners are incentivized to secure your coins because they're getting inflated away. Other people have different opinions on this. But main thing is, it is your coins. And Bitcoin's an example of this. Ordinals is hilariously an example of this because ordinals are just Bitcoin transactions looked at differently. I couldn't tell you exactly how the hell runes work, but something about op return, same deal. RGB is, I think, our first sort of non-trivial example of this because while not all the data is on chain, you do have a copy of it. RGB is really a way of moving non-Bitcoin assets around on Bitcoin, but the data that decides how these assets move isn't actually on chain. My own open timestamps thing is another example of this. Now, yeah, you can't go move assets on open timestamps, but you're creating timestamp proofs, and the proof data is on your side. And finally, although I don't think merge mining is very secure, I'll kind of put it in this category because to the extent it does work, this is what it does. So, L2s, on the other hand, I see them more about conglomeration of transactions and a reactive security model. And we need reactive security basically because we couldn't figure out how to make bidirectional payment channels without reactive security. Of course, CLTV payment channels is an example of just pure conglomeration. An interesting question here is, if this technical audience, who the heck knows what CLTV payment channel is? All right, a few people. There's probably more hands, except half the audience disappeared because I've seen this talk before. But the idea there is really you have a pot of money. Alice and Bob have a pot of money, and they're just signing transactions to give more of that money to Bob. Since it's just an option to take money, while we're taking many transactions and turning them to one, the security model is still kind of passive. Because Alice is not in a position where Bob can do anything but just get the best deal, which is correct. Lightning, on the other hand, as we may know, Lightning is about trying to do this in both directions. And the key thing about Lightning is if you're in that cave with your Lightning wallet and at some point in the past there's been a state where on that channel you own less of it, your counterparty could publish that state and you have to do something about it. Or with Watchtower, someone else has to do something about this on your behalf. If you don't do something, you'll lose your money. And finally, ARC. It's the same kind of model, but sort of with an expiration time. We'll talk more about ARC in a second. So we can kind of come up with sort of a somewhat formal definition. An L2, at least a Bitcoin L2, should be a way of transferring Bitcoin such that there's either unilateral withdrawal, which is obviously the preferred option. We want to be able to just take our money out. Or we want our counterparty not benefit from fraud. And the last one's kind of interesting because Lightning, this isn't as well known as maybe it should be, but Lightning is actually an example of both models at once. And the reason is HTLCs. So the core of how Lightning transfers funds around is these hash time lock contracts. In a hash time lock contract, it means that when I go send you a million Satoshis on Lightning, at some point in time during this whole Lightning negotiation process, there really is a transaction, technically actually more than one transaction, but keep it simple. But there really is a transaction with an output that is locked to that pre-image that's part of the Lightning contract. Now, 1,000,000 Satoshis, obviously, if you can go put an output with 1,000,000 Satoshis, you can definitely economically redeem that at current feed rates. On the other hand, in Lightning, you can also go send an HTLC and make a Lightning payment of 1 Satoshi. So is that Lightning payment real? I mean, I can't represent this on chain directly. I can't profitably make a 1 output, 1 Satoshi output. And indeed, with current Bitcoin standardness rules, it's hard to even broadcast at all. I might have to go call up Mara and get it slipstreamed. But the way we make this payment real is there's a second mechanism in Lightning, which is for very small payments that are below sort of a dust threshold. While the payment is in flight, the value of it is added to the fee of the transaction that would be mined to close the Lightning channel. And this is sort of an economic incentive. If I have a Lightning channel open with you and there's a payment in flight, neither one of us can economically steal 1 Satoshi, because to close the channel is going to cost us a couple hundred Satoshis. It just doesn't make economic sense. So while I can't directly withdraw that value, either party cannot benefit from fraud. And that seems in practice to be enough to make people not try to steal 1 Satoshi outputs in Lightning. Seems to work. As for the unilateral withdrawal, again, it seems to work pretty well. Lightning's used in a lot of cases. There really aren't that many attempts at stealing money from Lightning channels that do not appear to be simple mistakes like people restoring old backups. Now, as I was saying about marketing in L2, there's a lot of things that get called L2s and really aren't. And I will go and point out, I think I have seen Blockstream's marketing people call Liquid an L2. Liquid is just a fancy bank. Ultimately your money is held by a couple custodians. Sure, they have fancy multisig, but there's no way within the system to get your money back. Cashew, it's the same deal, different way of doing transactions, but the money is ultimately held by the Cashew custodian. In state chains, Volcker Ventures actually asked me to go and evaluate state chains, but the weird thing about it is it's a category of L2 where if your counterparty hasn't been doing anything dishonest, at the moment they can't steal from you. But if they have been doing something dishonest in the past and potentially collude with other parties you're trying to pay, they can steal from you. And I'd say that doesn't quite meet my definition of L2. So I didn't put it in the paper. So next part of our definitions. Well, what the heck is a covenant? And this is actually a slide I changed this morning because I've been trying to explain it to people and realizing I don't quite get it right. So what I'm going to say covenant is a restriction on where funds can go when an output is spent. And that's important because we have many other opcodes that restrict how funds can be spent. The most obvious one being, of course, checksig. How can it be spent? Well, with approval. If it weren't for checksig, Lightning wouldn't be here, Bitcoin wouldn't be very interesting. But a covenant says when the money is spent, if we hit the covenant path that enforces this, we've already decided where the funds go. And an interesting example of a covenant, something that's actually already used, is pre-signed transactions. Lightning uses this under the hood to basically make HTLCs work in the case of revoked transactions. Because again, with Lightning, it's all based on punishing fraud. Now imagine we have an HTLC in flight, like, 100 blocks ago. It's all being completely resolved. That HTLC could be a revoked state. And basically, we have to make sure that if this revoked state appears on chain, even if the HTLC path is followed, there's a way to get the money back. And for reasons I really don't have time to go into, that is actually uses covenant, because this Lightning implementations, the Lightning protocol, uses pre-signed transactions to make sure there's this extra way of spending that HTLC using the revocation data. Check template verify, which I understand is going to be talked about next in the next panel, or next talk. That's probably your simplest example of a covenant opcode, because all it really does is it says, well, what the heck is the spending transaction? Let's hash it in a way that leaves out the inputs and match that to the digest value on the stack. If it matches, we're done. Script's allowed to continue. If it doesn't, script fails validation. And that's a very simple covenant. It just says if this opcode is reached in the script, that's exactly how it can be spent. This is where all the money is going. Now, an interesting thing about this, of course, is this cannot be used recursively, because this is all based on hashing. And hashes cannot be made recursively. Well, no, maybe they can, but if they can, we're all screwed and Bitcoin doesn't work. So we've said in advance where the money will go, much like a pre-signed transaction. But notably, we can set this up in a way where there's no, with a pre-signed transaction, there might be another pre-signed transaction out there that you can't know about. With CTV, you've locked into this. OPCAT, well, OPCAT itself isn't directly a covenant, but because it lets you build up transactions on the stack in complex ways, you can implement covenants with this, and you can implement very complex covenants, even recursive covenants, because you can build up your data for the spending transaction, hash it, and through other mechanisms, validate that this matches the spending transaction. OPCAT can kind of do a lot, and that's a potential problem. Finally, there's a whole lot of little opcodes that people propose that are covenants for very specific use cases. I kind of somewhat derisingly say, it's like op-evict, off-leap something, op-tree magic. There's a very long list of these. I think realistically, the politics of Bitcoin means these ain't getting in. But it's interesting to note, people have come up with specific covenants for specific cases for a lot of things. So, one more little detour before we get into the meat of it, which is mempools are kind of a mess. And why am I even bringing up mempools? Well, if we have reactive security, we can be in a position where someone needs to get a transaction mined or they can have money stolen. So again, let's go back to the Lightning channel. I have a Lightning channel with you. If you can prevent me from getting my transaction mined, you can probably get in a position where you can take my money. You could certainly, if you can just hypothetically prevent me from ever getting a transaction mined, you can certainly make me eventually give up, and you then eventually just broadcast a revoked state and take money that isn't yours. So one of the dumbest examples of how this can be a problem is something we actually finally fixed after 14 years, full RBF. Well, why is full RBF relevant? Because of transaction pinning. Well, why is that relevant? Well, basically imagine if you could just tell miners, hey, do not accept a replacement to this transaction. Whatever's in your mempool, just let it sit there. That would effectively mean there's probably scenarios where you can get a low fee transaction that just isn't going to get mined, and you can basically just wait me out. And now that full RBF's on, all transactions can be replaced, roughly speaking, and we've kind of fixed this issue. In fact, the pull request to remove the option to turn off full RBF, that actually got merged into Bitcoin Core's Git repo yesterday. So next release, we're done. But next issue with all this is, well, how do you pay fees? And if you've been thinking a bit about covenants, you realize pretty quickly things like check template verify, and even pre-signed transactions, how do you know what fee rate you're going to pay? And this gets ugly quickly because fee rates change a lot. Lightning, I think it's fair to say the original Lightning protocol kind of just glossed over this and just assumed if you set a high enough fee rate, it's going to get mined. And that's certainly not true. Fee rates these days have ranged anywhere from 1 sat per V byte all the way up to 1,000 sats per V byte to get into the next block. No one is going to pre-sign transactions at 1,000 sats per V byte just in case. So we have a bunch of mechanisms that's designed to fix this, like child pays for parent, anchor outputs, and the dark horse there out of band fee payment. Well, child pays for parent says, obviously the economic incentive is if a child transaction pays a lot of money, but it needs a parent to get mined, well, you go mine both of them. And Bitcoin Core has supported this for a while, but it hasn't always been easy to actually use, and that's where anchor outputs comes in. Anchor outputs is just saying, hey, why don't we have an output of a transaction whose sole purpose is for child pays for parent. And the most sophisticated example of that, which recently got into Bitcoin, it was first in the 28 release Bitcoin Core, was keyless anchor outputs, which is just an output that has no spending conditions. Anyone can spend it. Well, that's useful because anyone can add fees to an output, to a transaction, using child pays for parent in a keyless output. And in the next version of Bitcoin Core, we'll probably have the ability to make these anchor outputs have no satoshis attached, which simplifies protocol design. This is relevant because of the dust limit. I mean, if the dust limit didn't exist, we wouldn't need this complexity, but that's a whole other issue. And finally, when we're talking about fee payments, we got to bring up out-of-band payments. Great example, you go to mempool.space, click on an unconfirmed transaction, it'll go pop up and ask you for a Lightning invoice for like $30-something to get it mined. It's cool that it exists, but if a lot of people start using this, we now have a problem for mining decentralization. Because if I'm a miner with an S9 in my basement and I'm trying to go solo mine, I can't make money from this. There is no conceivable way where mempool.space is going to figure out who I am and send me that $30. Now, if 1% of transaction use this, well, I mean, whatever. But if we screw up fee payments, we could be in a world where out-of-band fee payments are very common, and that makes starting up new mining pools really hard. So, and I kind of already brought this up a bit, but transaction pinning is your next ugly issue, and that really comes down to that miner incentives don't always translate into how Bitcoin Core works. And the simplest way to understand this is, imagine you're at a cattle auction. You go show up at that auction, you have a really, really big hat, and you go and say, I want one cow for $1. Actually, let's make it 10,000 cows. Let's really buy a lot of cow here. Well, 10,000 cows, $1, that's $10,000, right? It's a very big bid, but it's also completely economically irrational. No one's going to sell me even one cow for $1. It's not going to happen. The problem with Bitcoin Core is the equivalent in transaction space means that I can't update my bid with, that was a stupid idea. I'm going to buy one cow for $1,000. Bitcoin Core will not allow a replace transaction to reduce the value in the mempool, even though it's a much better deal. Essentially, this is about, it doesn't allow a replacement by fee rate. And I have a proposal to just allow that replacement by fee rate. And there's a bunch of discussion about that because some people argue it allows DOS attacks, which, I could give a 20-minute talk about this. Other people have gotten into Bitcoin Core something called truck, which just says we're not going to allow the first bid in certain conditions. We're basically going to say that if a transaction has version number 3, it cannot be more than a certain size. And that size is quite small. It's about 1,000 V-bytes. And the idea there is, well, that's so small. Well, the bad guy can kind of outbid us. He can't outbid us by very much. So in the event someone tries to prevent a transaction from getting replaced, we can outbid them fairly cheaply. It's an interesting issue. We've kind of made some progress with truck, although I think it's not a very great solution. But that's another question. And finally, the last one where mempools are an interesting mess is something called replacement cycling. And again, this is sort of an economic attack on miners, because basically what replacement cycling does is it lets the adversary get a perfectly valid transaction completely dropped from mempools. And from a miner's point of view, well, this is a terrible idea, because now I had a perfectly valid transaction that I could mine right now that I'm not mining because I've dropped it from my mempool. And an obvious way to fix replacement cycling is just rebroadcast dropped transactions. I also have another proposal called OPEXPIRE, which fixes most of the cases where this matters. But it's sort of an open question. We haven't made much progress to go and fix this comprehensively. But there are paths forward, so I'm not too worried about these kinds of issues. So let's go to motivation. And we did introduce this whole conference with someone saying, how do we scale Bitcoin to 1 billion people? In my paper, I also asked this question. And an interesting thing is you might ask, well, what is your goal? I mean, how many people do we really need Bitcoin to scale to? And I would say the minimum threshold for having custody of Bitcoin is, of course, to have a smartphone. Right? If you don't have a computer in your pocket, I mean, how on earth could you have custody of Bitcoin? You need at least this. This is your minimum requirement. Well, how many people in the world have smartphones? Estimates vary, but at least the sources I could find say on the order of like 4, maybe 5, maybe 6 billion people. So that is your potential market. It is not 10 billion people. It's certainly not 100 billion people. There aren't 100 billion people. And world population is probably going to trend down. So if we can do, like, say, 1 billion, we're actually pretty close. Well, can we do 1 billion? If you allocated like 90% of block space to just opening Lightning channels, you could open like 1.1 billion per year. Current implementations don't quite achieve that, but like if you batch all the channel openings together, they do it efficiently as possible, you can do about 1.1 billion per year. Another way to talk about this question is how many channels can have their capacity changed. Now this is the US, so if you guys have been following the rules, not many of you should have Phoenix Wallet. But Phoenix Wallet's pretty cool. Definitely not, yeah. I mean, I'm Canadian, so I get to have Phoenix Wallet. But Phoenix Wallet, it allows, it's the first widely used Lightning implementation that allows the amount of funds in the Lightning channel to be adjusted. And that's really useful because it means you can change capacity. And when you think about it, the minimum possible requirements to change capacity would be spend 1 UTXO, and then you mine 1 more UTXO. Right? You got to spend the UTXO holding the channel, make a new one. If you ask that question, assuming again batch transactions, we can adjust the capacity of, I think the number is like 300, 400 billion channels per year, using like 90% of block space. I don't know if it's realistic to say like people are going to adjust their channel capacity once per year, but certainly I think we can make the argument we can scale Lightning as is with no changes other than client side to at least 100, 200, maybe 300 billion, 300 million people per year. That's kind of the numbers we're working with. So that also touches on, well, why do we want better L2 systems in Lightning? We also want to be able to change liquidity. Right? With Lightning, if everyone has channels, we can be in a position where Lightning service providers, such as the company behind Phoenix, they're the ones holding the majority of the sort of consumer Bitcoin because people have channels where most of the money is on the other side. And that's certainly very expensive. I mean, holding Bitcoin, there's a time value cost here. There's a risk of it getting hacked. So that will cost money. And ideally, we can have ways of moving liquidity around without on-chain transactions. Now, depending on how people use Lightning, this may not actually be needed. I mean, if everyone's savers and they all have a Lightning channel with all their money, maybe it doesn't matter, but it's nice to have options. Finally, interactivity. Now, remember my example of a guy hiding from HBO in a cave? Well, can we have a Lightning that doesn't have such harsh penalties? Of course, one version of this gets me to my next slide, which is the first L2 system I reviewed in my paper. Confusingly called L2. It's a terrible name. That's why we said screw this. We're calling it L symmetry. I think anyone who tried to give a talk about L2 realized it was a terrible name. But L symmetry wants to reduce the complexity of Lightning with respect to interactivity by changing Lightning from a punishment system to an updating system. What I mean by that is, with L symmetry, I have a Lightning channel with you. Let's suppose I hypothetically put a revoked state on chain that just happens to give me all the money, when currently the state is you should have all the money. With L symmetry, you can then update that revoked state on chain with the correct one where you have all the money. And then I can go say, oh, you know what? Actually, I have an even newer state where actually we split the money in half. And obviously, if we're buddies, this seems like a good idea. I mean, why should one person just grab all the money? But I'm not convinced L symmetry actually works in a real decentralized peer-to-peer setting. Having said that, some of the biggest Lightning channels out there are things like between Kraken and, Bitfinex. And under those circumstances, it's probably reasonable to reduce the consequences of screwing up. Also, while L symmetry directly doesn't change the scaling of Lightning, it does potentially allow things that allow more than one UTXO to be, more than one user per UTXO. And speaking of things that allow more than one user per UTXO, well, channel factories. So the observation here is, now recall how Lightning works, right? You have a shared UTXO, and then you have unbroadcast transactions that could be used to spend that UTXO. What if we push this back like one more step, right? What if the UTXO creating the channel isn't actually confirmed on chain? Well, the transaction that creates that UTXO, you can imagine a scenario where, like, say, 3 entities, Alice, Bob, and Charlie, they have a shared UTXO. It's a multi-sig held by them all. And then they sign a transaction that then would create 3 Lightning channels between each other, if only it got mined. The question here is that a valid Lightning channel? And the answer is yes. Because if they need to unilaterally withdraw, they can go on chain by publishing 2 transactions. Now, in this scenario, if Alex, Bob, and Charlie have spent their time moving money around and have finally decided, you know what, we're done. We can do something with that fund, the pot of money. They can they can collectively agree to spend that money however way they want, right? If it's a 3 of 3 multi-sig, they can just do what they want with it. And this mechanism gets called a channel factory, I think because it's sort of like a way of creating channels without actually having to do them on chain. The problem with channel factories is, this sounds all well and good for like 3 people. Maybe 3 people really could come to consensus later. I mean, certainly you can imagine like Kraken, Binance and OKX or whatever doing this to move money between each other. But how do you scale this like 100 people? Certainly in 100 people, one of them is going to drop out. And now you got to broadcast this big transaction on chain to actually make the channels. Well, the advanced channel factories is this big class of proposed L2 systems that want to improve on this by letting people join or leave the pool. And there's a lot of versions of this idea, but they all kind of center around having opcodes that use covenants to allow like one person to take their money out without everyone taking their money out. And op-evict comes from one of these proposals. It's the idea of you evict certain set of funds out of it, and then that person gets their money back. They get unilateral withdrawal, but everyone else continues on. Advanced channel factories, it's a complex topic, and honestly, I think any of the ones that rely on specialized opcodes, they really have zero chance of actually getting implemented. But channel factories, because it doesn't require a soft fork, that's plausible, and I am told that there are genuine startups with real intentions working on actually implementing this. Actually, one of my friends apparently just got a job at one of them. I don't know really how far this is, but it's a plausible thing. So, if we have the idea of virtual UTXOs, we also could think, well, why don't we trade virtual UTXOs themselves? And that's really where ARC comes in. So ARC is a couple parts. The first is, let's use covenants to take a pool of money and split it up. Now, if we split it up to a bunch of little UTXOs, imagine I'm the guy with the pool of money. I'll be called the ARC service provider. And I create that pool of funds in such a way that there are covenants splitting it up in a tree of transactions so that all of you have one virtual UTXO. Now, the question here is that money real? And the answer is yes, in a way. You have the ability to get your money out and actually get your virtual UTXO on chain. So you do have money. It is yours. You have custody over it. The problem there is, well, what do we do with this? Well, you could imagine you could sign a transaction that takes that virtual UTXO and spends it again, sending that money somewhere else. Now you can move your money. But it's still not useful because to move your money, we're going to have to put it on chain. So we add one more part to this, which is we say the guy with the pool of money, the ARC service provider, there's an expiry time where then all the money reverts back to him. And if everyone with a virtual UTXO has moved it before the expiry time, we now have an efficient way of moving funds around off-chain. So that looks pretty cool. And because it's virtual UTXO, we can do the channel factories trick and also open Lightning channels. There's a bunch of complexity to like the nuances of how this should work, but it looks interesting, and there is a version of Arc which could be implemented now with pre-signed transactions. In fact, you can actually run this for real. And I believe they're going to get to the point where you can, in theory, do this in production fairly quickly. But the big issue with all this, or the really open question is, how does liquidity work here? And think about it. If owning a virtual UTXO means you have to move it before an expiry, well, the obvious thing to do is move it to a new Arc round. Well, if you're moving it to a new Arc round, what happens to the coins that have been locked up till the end of the expiry period? You're effectively going to have to go and pay for someone to provide those coins. Time value of money, it isn't going to be free. And the weird thing about this is the closer you get to the end of the round, the less that cost is. But the trade-off is the closer you get to the end of the round, the more likely it is that the Arc service provider is just going to take your money. Frankly, I don't know how this is going to play out. I suspect if people actually use Arc for consumer wallets, the mechanism is probably going to be that if you don't move your money before the end of the round, the ASP promises to just put in a new round. There may also be more complex versions of Arc that fix this with additional covenant magic. It's not really clear like what's possible here, but we'll see how this plays out. And the fact you can implement Arc now without a soft fork means we can get experience. And economically, what does Arc really mean? So, the final big category of L2s, and I believe this was mentioned earlier by the previous talk, is rollups. And rollups basically says, well, why don't we have another L2 system with sort of its own kind of consensus, its own chain or something like that? And then we use zero-knowledge proofs to prove that the rules of this secondary system were followed. Well, what are zero-knowledge proofs? They're basically a truly magic cryptographic technique, which says, I have a function, I have data that I can put into that function, and I can prove to you with this proof that I actually ran that function and it returned true. But I don't have to show you all of the data. And in the context of Bitcoin script, that would mean I could take the consensus of the secondary system, process all the rules of it, and then prove to the rest of the Bitcoin world, hey, those rules were followed, this data, this money is now allowed to move in this way. Rollups are cool, although I'm not clear that they actually qualify as L2s. The reason really is, do you really have unilateral withdrawal in this? And this comes down to L2s are, one way to think about them is they're shared databases. They have a state that's shared by two or more people. And this also comes into this concept of proof of publication. Bitcoin's an example of proof of publication. If you have a system that depends on Bitcoin, the rules of the system can prove that certain data was published to everyone who might want to have that data. So Lightning's a very trivial example of this. Proof of publication in Lightning means when I close the channel unilaterally without your knowledge, you are guaranteed to learn that the channel was closed and you can take appropriate action. This is very important for revoked states because by publishing the revoked state to the chain, it is guaranteed, assuming you have a copy of the chain to begin with, that you can get the necessary information to punish me for it. Arc is kind of like this too, in that if some people unilaterally withdraw their money, they have to publish transactions to the chain that let other people learn what part of the pool has been unilaterally withdrawn. It's kind of a trivial example, but it is an example of this. Things like rollups, though, if I don't have the full state of the rollup, how exactly do I publish a transaction to peel off my funds and get it on chain? It's not really clear. In some versions of rollups, you simply go publish things on chain. In some versions, you might go challenge people for the data. But economics matters, and we need a system where it is infeasible for counterparties to profit from this. And I got to point out, I'm not sure that ARC actually qualifies as an L2 system for small amounts because of expiry. So, rollups isn't the only thing with this kind of issue, but, it's something to consider. I'd also say the issue of shared database proof of publication means that there's a limit to how well these things can scale. Now remember, everything comp size a tree, approximately everything. Well, in cryptography, everything's hash functions. Well, how do we represent a tree in cryptography? We take a tree of pointers and we hash all the data. Well, how do we publish part of the state of a database if it looks like a tree? Well, we publish some part down that tree. That's like what ARC does. Any rollup that has this kind of thing is probably going to have something like log2n scaling, where n is sort of how many accounts there are, how many outputs there are. So there are limits how well we can scale this, which in itself is kind of interesting. But final thing I want to go touch is what is the scaling situation with failure? So obviously with L1s, there is no failure. Your money's just there. The L1 itself could fail, but your money is just there. With Lightning, the worst case is an entity like Phoenix not only fails, not only they stop responding, but they start publishing invalid state and revoked states. Because whenever they publish a revoked state, you must go respond or you lose your money. But the nice thing about that is at least there's a limit to how much badness can happen, how much revoked state can happen at once. Because for every channel that they want to steal money from, they have to at least publish one transaction. So the scaling between it working and it not working is roughly 1-to-1-ish, right? One punishment transaction for one revoked state. And a nuance here is, remember, in Lightning, if your counterparty just stops talking to you, you don't actually have to do anything yet. Your money's safe, you can't move it, but they can't steal it yet. They have to actively do something to steal your money. With ARC, well, you've got that expiry time. And there probably are circumstances in ARC where if a big enough ARC ASP fails, you're going to run out of chain space to unilaterally withdraw. Because the ratio of data that the ARC service provider needs to take all your money is just so much smaller than all of the people. Again, there are potential ways to go mitigate this issue, maybe have mechanisms to delay the publication and so on, but certainly naive ARC has this issue. So, path forward. Well, I think here people are going to talk more about the specifics of this, but I think the big thing I want to go say is, in fact, bottom of my slide. So very bottom of my slide is supposed to be do nothing. It's the biggest slide there. But yeah, do nothing is certainly an option because we're actually reasonably close to getting our billion users that we kind of talked about. Other things, there's a lot of different opcodes that do a lot of stuff. CTV, and of course that's our next talk, CTV I think personally is interesting precisely because it doesn't do that much. I don't think CTV is perfect. Certainly fee payments in CTV is ugly, but it has a lot less risks than something like OpCat, which can do basically anything. And I'll say L-enhance is, I think, an interesting lesson. Because certainly in my blog post, I kind of had to say, well, no one actually made the argument for it. There's a BIP there, but the BIPs don't tell you why it's useful. And I'm not going to trawl through Bitcoin talk posts to figure out what exactly it's meant to go do. That's not my role as a review writer. We also talked about the great consensus cleanup in the previous talk, and yeah, I think it's a good idea too. And it will give us a chance to figure out, can we actually get consensus to go do something? Great consensus cleanup should be pretty, should be easy to agree on, but that's an interesting question. And yeah, can we get a soft fork activated? Well, fortunately, this was covered pretty well by the first talk, but I'll give my personal opinion, which is I would much rather see soft fork activated through overwhelming consensus. You know, we have things like speedy trials and so on, which always kind of bother me because it's like, why do we need a speedy trial for a soft fork? Shouldn't we be proposing something we all agree on? But I don't know. We'll have to go see how that plays out. And the nice thing about this is, at least with covenants, you can simulate, or indeed you can implement so much with pre-signed transactions that I would strongly advise anyone actually working on a project, figure out a way to go do it now. You know, you might have to make a trade-off, like pre-signed transaction ARC does, where everyone's online, but this isn't necessarily the end of the world. I mean, I think ARC could work in a situation, say, between exchanges, where they just assume they're always online and they can always sign transactions as needed. You know, that'll give us insight into how this actually works in practice. And at least from a coding perspective, I mean, you can always go put in NOPs and pretend they're opcodes. Like, you can do nearly everything except actually enforce it. So with that, thank you.